Today, Mr. Blair said that ultimately the decision to go to war in Iraq was his judgment alone. Well, Iraq is likely to be both his legacy and his epitaph. To look at his performance today in defending his decisions, we're joined now from our studio in central London by John Rentoul. He's chief political commentator for The Independent on Sunday and Blair's biographer. John Rentoul, well, Tony Blair always deeply believed, and he said it again today, that the war was the right thing. He's not a man given to doubts, is he?
No, I mean, the one thing I thought that was surprising about his testimony today was that it was very much from the Alistair Campbell school of strategic communications. It was not give an inch, be strong and be forceful. You know, I thought it would have been a more impressive performance actually if he'd defended the decision to join the American invasion in that way, because I mean I think that is completely defensible and justified and can be defended to the nth degree. But I thought he should have conceded a bit more on the mishandling of the occupation afterwards, because I think I think he should have expressed some contrition for the 100,000 Iraqis dead. We just discussed
the post-invasion with Clive Soley, and I want to ask you more about the man. I mean, just looking at him, he did seem quite rattled at the beginning. I mean, the BBC's political editor Nick Robinson observed how his hands were shaking when he tried to pour himself some water. So he wasn't clearly at ease, was he?
Well, he was nervous, but I think he was nervous about the performance aspect of it rather than about the case he was about to make. I mean, I think it was very important to him that he should defend himself as best he could. And so, you know, and I think also he decided that he shouldn't go in all guns blazing, as it were. He should be practical and pragmatic rather than messianic, which he's often accused of being by his opponents.
Well, I mean, he is accused of being that because, of course, we know he's a very committed Christian, but it has somehow coloured his perception of the rightness of going to war in Iraq. He doesn't just talk about it, about the legality, but he presents it as a kind of moral, just war, almost.
Yes, but I don't think he does bring God into it, actually. I think it's his opponents accuse him of being messianic and receiving dictated messages from the Almighty.
He talks about the morality of the rightness of removing Saddam Hussein.
Yeah. That's just another way of saying that you think it's right. I mean, you know, I mean, I do think that the morality of it is more important than the legality of it, actually, and I think that's perfectly legitimate to argue for it in those terms. He's actually quite careful, I think, to keep religion out of it.
And just very quickly, how would he feel about Iraq being his legacy, his epitaph?
Well, I think he hates it. I mean, I think he must be torn. He must have been torn today, because he would have welcomed the opportunity to defend himself again, because he knew he could do it, and he knew he can do it well, which he did. But the whole Chilcot inquiry, especially the way it's been reported in the media in this country, has just reminded everybody of Iraq, and it's just further associated Iraq with him and with his legacy.
All right, John Rentoul, thanks very much indeed.
On this Friday evening in Baghdad, most people are simply getting on with life, either oblivious or not really caring about the grilling that Tony Blair has been getting at the hands of the Chilcot inquiry. The whole affair has had very little coverage in the Iraqi press, and the few articles that there have been have tended to see it as very much a British affair. This editorial here, for example, in yesterday's newspaper, questioning the timing of it in the run-up to a general election, seeing it as taking place within a kind of British political bubble. Iraqis have a whole host of problems that they deal with on a daily basis, from continued violence to poor public services and intermittent electricity supplies, and the view generally is that this inquiry isn't going to help overcome those problems. There are, though, those here in Iraq who agree with Tony Blair that there have been positive effects from the 2003 invasion. There's been, for example, an explosion in the availability of consumer goods, mobile phones, televisions, freezers, fridges and the like. There's also the question of freedom of speech. People here are quite happy to openly talk about their political preferences, and on television indeed, in the upcoming election. 7th of March, people are putting a lot of hope into that and hoping that that will bring some kind of stability if they can be carried out peacefully. Now, as far as the politicians are concerned here, what they'll be looking at out of this inquiry is not so much the circumstances surrounding the decision to go to war, but more the question of legality. If the Chilcot inquiry throws that into doubt, there are those in the government here who fear that that could provide fuel to the insurgency. And while the security situation here has got better, it is still costing hundreds of lives every month. Gabriel Gatehouse, BBC News in Baghdad.
Well, for an Iraqi perspective, we're joined here in the studio by the Iraqi independent journalist and writer and also former government spokesman Hamid Alkifaey. Hamid Alkifaey, so for many people in Britain, or some people in Britain, I should say, we saw the protesters, Tony Blair very much the villain, but he's a hero to a lot of people in Iraq, isn't he?
Yes, you know, I mean, many people who hated Saddam Hussein were happy that he was removed. And obviously Tony Blair was party to that effort. So people don't really regard him as a villain, as some people in this country.
I mean, in fact, Barham Saleh, who is the Prime Minister of the Kurdistan in Iraq, has called him very much a hero and said, come and see the mass graves, and we would have had more if Saddam Hussein and his sons had been in power. So but are some Iraqis perhaps now, because of all that has happened, all those deaths and the suffering and the violence, perhaps quite indifferent or don't really care very much about this sort of thing?
Indeed, because people were hoping that if Saddam goes, then a new country will be established, money will be spent to, you know, on reconstruction. The country will be open, you have a real democracy. All these things didn't happen. Instead, we have, you know, all instability, violence, and also unemployment, and also religious parties in charge instead of having a real democracy. So all these things, all these drawbacks were not, you know, thought about at the time of removing Saddam Hussein.
But never to the extent that Iraqis feel that they would rather have seen Saddam Hussein and his sons in power, what Tony Blair called the 2010 test. Would you like Saddam to be here in 2010?
Well, certainly not Saddam Hussein. Nobody wants Saddam Hussein to stay. Except
so Tony Blair was right to say that?
Absolutely, he's right. But you see, yes, Saddam, very few people supported him even then, because he, you know, everyone now knows what he did to the country, all these wars and, you know...
And questions of, like, legality of the war, which is something that obviously exercises an awful lot of people, whether there was a UN resolution and so on. Is there that kind of discussion amongst Iraqis? Do they care about that?
People don't... some people do bring this up because, you know, those who are pro the regime, the Saddam regime, say this is an illegal war. But as we know, that countries go to war, they don't need a UN resolution when they go to war. Britain and the United States went to war on behalf of their own countries, not on behalf of Iraq or on behalf of the international community. It was for their own reasons. Obviously, there was the suggestion that there was WMD, but WMD did exist in Iraq. Saddam Hussein did use chemical weapons. So there was this history.
All right, Hamid Alkifaey, got to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed.